Most of us don't spend much time thinking about fish. They exist somewhere beneath the surface of the water, distant and easy to overlook unless they're on our plates. Biologist and writer Jonathan Balcombe challenges this by inviting readers to consider a surprising question. What might the inner life of a fish actually look like? The excerpt I'll be reading follows a nameless man in the moments throughout his life when he slowly begins to see fish not as objects in the water, but as living creatures capable of feeling. I'll admit, of all the topics that someone could become fascinated by, fish empathy is probably not the most common one, and it is a slightly niche interest to explain to people. But his book approaches ecology from a more unique, almost philosophical angle, something I appreciated as someone who has always felt caught between the worlds of STEM and the humanities. Through the narrator's observations and lived experiences, the subject felt far more alive to me than any diagram in a textbook ever could. So, this is What a Fish Knows by Jonathan Balcombe. When I was 8, I climbed into an aluminum rowboat with the elderly director of a summer camp north of Toronto. He rowed a quarter mile out into the shallow bay, and we spent the next 2 hours fishing. It was a calm summer evening, and the water was like glass. It was my first time in a small boat, and floating on this vast, faintly undulating expanse of dark water was exhilarating. I wondered what creatures lurked below, and this stoked my excitement whenever the sudden jerk of my primitive fishing hook, a stripped sapling with a line and hook, signaled that a fish had struck the bait. I caught 16 fish that day. Some released, several others, larger bass and perch, we kept for breakfast the next morning. Mr. Nelson did all the dirty work, baiting the barbed hooks with writhing earthworms, twisting the wire out of the fish's lips, plunging his knife into their skulls to kill them. His face contorted strangely as he performed these tasks, and I wondered if he was feeling revulsion or if he was merely lost in concentration. I have some fond memories of that experience. But as a sensitive boy with a soft spot for animals, I was disturbed by a lot of what went on in that rowboat. I worried privately about the worms. I fretted that the fish felt pain as a stubborn hook was extracted from their bony, staring faces. Maybe one of the keepers survived the knife and was dying slowly in the wire basket dangling over the side. But the kind man sitting at the bow didn't seem to think there was anything wrong, so I rationalized that it must be okay. And the taste of fresh fish at breakfast the next morning left only vague remnants of misgivings from the previous evening. That was not my only childhood encounter with fish that raised conflicting emotions about our cold-blooded cousin's place in our moral calculus. In fourth grade, I was one of a few kids recruited to move some supplies from our classroom to a neighboring room at my elementary school in Toronto. Among the items was a glass fishbowl containing a lone goldfish. The vessel was 3/4 full of water and quite heavy. Concerned that the fish not be placed in the hands of someone who might care less than I did, I volunteered to transport the bowl to its destination, a counter next to the sink in the adjoining room. How ironic. I firmly held the bowl in my child's hands and methodically walked out to the door, down the hall, and into the new room. As I gingerly approached the counter, the bowl slipped from my grasp and smashed onto the hard floor. It was a moment of horror that played out in slow motion. Shards of glass splintered, and water sloshed across the floor. I stood there, stunned. Someone with more wits than I grabbed the mop and moved the glass and the water to one side. Then the four of us began to scour the floor for the fish. A minute went by with no sign of the creature. It was like a bad dream. It seemed as if she had experienced goldfish rapture and had risen up to the fishy heavens. Finally, someone found her. She had bounced behind a radiator and ended up on the inside lip, 2 inches from the floor and completely out of view. She was still alive, gawping meekly. She was quickly plopped into a beaker of tap water. I believe that fish survived. Though the goldfish incident left a deep impression of me, as evidenced by my vivid collection of it 4 decades later, I was not moved to a new empathy for fish. Admittedly, I never took a shine to fishing. What little enthusiasm remained after the outing with Mr. Nelson soon faded when it came time to bait and extract my own hooks. But I made no connection between the perch and bass I unceremoniously hauled up from Sturgeon Bay, or the hapless little goldfish I dropped at Edithville Elementary School, and the
Oh,
enormous fish who ended up in the filet-o-fish sandwiches I enjoyed on family trips to the local McDonald's. That was the late 60s, and already McDonald's was boasting over 1 billion served. They could as soon have been mentioning fish or chickens to customers. But like other members of my culture, I was blissfully removed from the once living, breathing creatures who ended up in my lunch. It was not until I took an ethicology course in the final year of my undergraduate biology degree 12 years later that I began to seriously question my relationship to animals, including fish. I was captivated by the fish's diverse anatomy and adaptations as I was disturbed by the parade of inert, once living bodies we were given to classify during dissecting microscopes and taxonomic keys. The class made a midterm visit to the Royal Ontario Museum, where we met one of Canada's foremost ichthyologists for a private tour of the museum's fish collection. At one point, he unlocked and raised the lid of a large wooden case to reveal an enormous lake trout floating in an oily preservative. The fish, weighing a record 103 pounds, had been attributed to a hormone imbalance that had rendered her sterile. Energy that would have normally been spent on the profligate task of egg production was instead assigned to body mass. I felt for that fish. Like most we encounter, she had no name and her life was a mystery. I felt she deserved a more dignified experience than entombment in a wooden case. To me, it would have been better had she been eaten, her tissues recycling back into the food chain, than to float for decades in darkness, polluted by chemicals. Thank you for listening.